Hey everybody, welcome to the Creative Nonfiction Project overview. Um, this is going to be a very brief overview, but essentially it's just to take you through what to expect in the next, 5 weeks or so as you work on your creative nonfiction projects. So just to kind of review what we've done so far, essentially the first month and a half of this class is devoted to teaching you pretty much standard, conventional academic writing. In composition departments all over the country for decades now, students have been introduced to college writing by way of the rhetorical analysis essay or the close reading essay. So that means putting students in conversation with texts, and, essentially teaching them how to engage in techniques of close analysis, of interpretive development, and like some of the stuff that you've seen me focus on constantly, which are things like clarity, organization, structure, and of course, for me, it's always about style too. So things at the sentence level, really thinking about how you're creating or establishing that kind of balance between you and the text, or contexts that you've been writing about. So now we're going to totally switch gears. So for some of you, that's going to be kind of scary, like, what the hell? Now we're doing something I've never done before. And for others, it's going to be super exhilarating, maybe a little bit of both, hopefully, because it's new. And there are many people who, don't really use these kinds of techniques in a writing, in a freshman composition course like this. Oftentimes you'll see them, and many of you may have written versions of this in more kind of I guess they call them developmental courses, but I don't really think of them that way because these are kind of actually sophisticated writing techniques. But you will see in developmental courses sometimes teachers who have their students engage in personal writing. Sometimes there'll be prompts about stuff like, courage, or, write about a time where you had to be courageous, or write about a time, when you had to use discipline, kind of SAT style, sort of basic prompts, but they're interesting if you if you allow them to be. They can be very interesting if you're really thinking about what it means to write about something in a way that's compelling for an audience that actually doesn't depend at all on an author, a published author's words. So right now you've been reading so much of Coates. You've been thinking about his perspective of the world constantly and using that perspective to craft a perspective of your own about what he has to say. So this is like exploding all of that. And now you're not going to be quoting from other people. You're not even going to really depend on anybody for their perspective of the world. It's all about you now, right? For better or worse, your project is going to develop around, in the exact same way that Coates' book does, around the way in which your personal life, and this might draw from your sense of identity, where you come from, your culture, your ethnicity, your sexuality, your gender. These are just possible, a few possibilities that I've seen in the past. But there are a lot more, there are a lot of options in that range. But essentially, you're going to be drawing upon something like that and connecting it to a broader social, cultural, in some cases, ecological, or political community. So now it's going to make sense, why I had you spend so much time writing about synecdoche, because synecdoche is that rhetorical structure that uses the part, right, the individual, to make a comment or to make a statement about the whole. So you're connecting the part to the whole, and in the autoethnography that you'll be writing for the next few weeks, right, you're the part here. and you're putting yourself in the context of a greater community, and your experience in the context of a greater community. So in my many years of teaching this project, I can promise you that students really love it. I mean, even though it's a difficult project, it's really fun. You get to reflect a lot on yourself and find ways to, and think about things, I think, that you might not be used to thinking about, stuff in your everyday ordinary life that you don't tend to value as worthy of, an audience or a reader's attention. So taking your life and imagining, in some sense, crafting that into an object of art, is really what you're doing. And that's why it's called a creative nonfiction project, because it is drawing upon your own experiences. Now, that said, because this is personal essay writing, and it can feel, and because, as you know, I'm a teacher who's devoted to public writing. That's what we do in this class. I want to give you some options, so you don't feel like you have to go. You don't necessarily have to go where Coates went. Coates is deeply personal. I mean, he lays it out there. He really shows you. He bears his heart and soul. And that might be something that you think, hell yeah, like I want to do that, but you don't have to. I mean, if you don't feel comfortable with that, I'm giving you some options to do a type of autoethnography writing that can draw upon specific aspects of personal experience. And one of those would be travel writing. So when you go to the Creative Nonfiction Project overview and you read about this project and what you'll be doing with it, you have a bunch of options. So, this is what you'll be doing, everything that I just said. And then you can decide, okay, I already know what I want to write about. I want to write about maybe growing up mixed race. I've had a lot of projects about that. Or I want to write about, being multilingual. Or you might say, I'd rather stick to something like travel. So I've given you prompts that explain to you what travel writing for an autoethnography project will look like. And I've given you some samples of travel writing, really, really good travel writing stories and essays. These are all nonfiction, keep in mind. And they are written by, famous or somewhat famous authors. Obviously, David Sedaris and David Foster Wallace are extremely famous. But some, famous and not so famous people who write about travel. If you do decide to write about travel or about nature, you have instructions for both of these choices, and you have samples for both of these choices that cover a really broad range. One thing that you just need to keep in mind is that, to don't think about travel as like going to a place, right? Travel is a very, very intricate and complex concept even. So you could do a travel writing project that focuses exclusively on your commute to and from school. You could do travel writing that has to do with like daydreaming, traveling in your mind. This is there are so many images of this in literature, of this idea of a mental travel. So, travel writing can mean a lot of different things. It doesn't, and it shouldn't really be just about like, my trip to England or whatever, because that's just frankly boring. So what if you went somewhere? What do you have to say about travel that's engaging and interesting? I mean, think of all of the terrible travel blogs that you go to online, and they always say the same shit. It's like, I went here, expanded my mind, blah, blah, blah. But, try to think outside the box. It's supposed to be creative after all, right? So you can do travel writing. You can also do nature writing. And the same thing that I said about travel also applies to nature. People tend to write about nature as this place you go to for refuge. It's peaceful. But nature is all around us. And, nature is also violent and terrifying. If you pay any attention to what's going on in the news, you know this. Natural disasters are all around us. So if you've ever had a meaningful experience with a natural disaster, that would be a really great nature writing project. So it doesn't always have to be, right? It can be, nature is something that's happening in our lives constantly, or the lack thereof, right? And also, what the hell does nature even mean? Uh, Human nature and the natural world can be very at odds, right? And that's also a kind of interesting nature writing project, as long as you're writing about yourself and it's nonfiction and it connects meaningfully to some broader socio-cultural, political, ecological, right, community or context, then you have yourself a project, and it really becomes about ironing out the details and just making it really good. So the reason why I suggest that you do an interview, especially if you go with the, I'd like to do a creative nonfiction project that draws upon my family background, I strongly encourage you to interview people that know you very well. A lot of students in the past have interviewed parents, found out things about their parents that they didn't even know. I had a student who found out that her father was a political activist in China, and she was very shocked by that. And he was actually kind of like a hardcore activist. So, you can find all kinds of things out when you take your ordinary everyday life and you put it in a different context. So I would suggest that if, no matter what, prepare to interview somebody, just so that you can plan to put dialogue into your creative nonfiction project. It's a really good idea to use some fiction writing techniques, and I would say primarily dialogue, so that you can break up the monotony. You don't want this to sound like a kind of standard essay. You actually want it to have people and actors, you want there to be a kind of set or staging. And so, you can quote from that person in the interview, and that would be a really great thing to do. So you also have tips here for how to conduct an interview, and, how to, with sample questions, with interview tips. You can do an experienced, figure from your life, or some person you respect, either because they're an academic and that's what those are the people you're around when you're in school, or just somebody who shares a similar experience. So you have different kinds of ways to conduct an interview for each one of those, and you will at some point be asked to I'm not going to require you to do an interview because we don't really have time, since we have 3 units in this class, but it's a suggestion, right? It's a tip. And then the other thing would be for you to check out the student samples from past creative nonfiction projects in my classes. So there's 5 samples here from various students. They're not perfect. They've got things about them that are great, things about them that are not so great. It's actually up to you to kind of read through and determine which ones you like and which ones you don't, and why. But one thing to keep in mind is that all of these samples more or less follow the Coates model, which is to talk, to engage deeply with personal aspects of the student's own experiences and connect those to wider ranging issues. So, for example, I've had students who are DACA students who write about their experience as DACA students and then connect that to the broader context, the massive controversies over immigration since the election of Trump. I've had students who talk about being first-generation college students and how that has affected their lives, and they, of course, connect that to a broader kind of community having to do with education and opportunity. I've had students write about being poor. I've had students write about being about their LGBTQ experiences. It's entirely up to you. So you can go through these samples and kind of figure out what it is you want to do. This is the first time that I'm doing travel and nature writing in my class, so I don't have student samples for you about that, but you can be the first student sample if you're interested in it. I think it'll be a kind of a fun experience. Experiment, also experience. So, go through, read through the overview. And then basically what you're going to do is you're going to start small, which is to start with these short kind of descriptive writing assignments. Now, for the creative nonfiction project, you're going to have 2 writing assignments per week. And that's because you're not going to be doing the intense reading that you were asked to do for Between the World and Me. So instead of a 150-page book, which is a difficult book, you're actually going to be reading, like an excerpt from Jay-Z's, kind of autoethnography / memoir on hip hop. And then I'm going to have you imitate some strategies that Jay-Z employs when he writes that book. You'll also read, I think I have 3 short essays, but they're very, very, they're very short, and they're not requiring a lot of reading comprehension from you. So kind of think back to the self-assessment essay that I had you do at the beginning of the term, when I had you write about that Flannery O'Connor letter. This is kind of along those lines, the types of reading that you'll be doing. Some of them are a little bit more engaged and intense than that, but basically they're there to help you practice writing, right? The Coates was there to help you practice thinking, not practice writing. I mean, that too, but this stuff is more for the purposes of imitation. So a lot more writing for this one, a lot less reading, and that's why you have kind of 2 shorter writing assignments per week. And the writing assignments, they're not going to require any more intensity from you than the ones that you've been doing before. In fact, I think for a lot of you, the Coates writing will feel like it is far more complex and involved than the writing that you'll be doing for this project. It should feel like, the biggest challenge here is just being honest with yourself, which is harder for some of us than others, right? But it's really just about kind of engaging your experience in a way that helps your reader to connect with you, which is actually really hard, right? Because you're not telling them, this is what happened to me, right? We don't connect with people by telling them what happened. We connect with people by showing them how. So you tell a story, and that's how you get people to feel what you're feeling. And that takes a lot of work, right? And you have to end up writing and rewriting sentences, but not in the way that you would have been doing for the rhetorical analysis. It's actually, in some ways, a lot more fun because it's just about being more descriptive, right? Okay, so that's the introduction. You'll see here that you have your rhetorical analysis final is due, and then you have 2 pretty short writing practice assignments. Like I said, one of them is the Jay-Z. Another one is a short reading, and you don't even have to craft the response, but basically it's a reading of Lori Moore's essay about writing. And then the next week you'll read 2 short essays, one on travel, one on nature. And then I'm going to ask you to respond to that, and then you've got your first draft due. So things move much more quickly in Unit 2 than they did in Unit 1 in terms of the draft stage. So you've got your draft, and then you've got your first draft, and then you've got your formal draft, and then you'll have your final draft. So basically we have 1, 2, 3, 4 weeks with Unit 2, the creative nonfiction project. This should feel like a fun time in the course, and then we're going to move into Unit 3, which is the research project, and that's where we're going to completely switch gears. And basically what I'm going to do is take everyone through the techniques of researched argumentation that will prepare you to do really well in the next required course for all transfer students and also university students, right? You take 2 courses. One is first-year composition, and the second one is research and argumentation. And so I'm going to show everybody basically how to do research and argumentation so that you will do well in that class. And I'll give you an introduction to that unit as well. Okay, so hopefully that helped, and have fun with it. It's a good one. Okay, bye everybody.